Hey peeps, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we are looking at a new argument against causal finitism, which is a view that nothing can have infinitely many causes. My purpose in this video is entirely exploratory. I don't know whether or not the argument that I'm going to be developing here succeeds, but I certainly find it interesting and at least plausible. I actually shared this argument with Dr. Alexander Pruss, and he said it's a pretty powerful argument. That doesn't, of course, mean that he accepts it, but it does mean something. I'm actually interested in what you think about the argument, so any and all feedback is welcome. I'm not sure if I have the time to extensively engage, given that I'm in the full swing of grad school applications, and also given that, sadly, I've been having some headaches as of late, but still, I might try to engage, and anyway, I just appreciate your feedback. Before getting into the meat of the video, here are some important announcements. First, check out the new Majesty of Reason Discord. You can chat with others about philosophy in there. I'll put a link in the description and in a pinned comment. Second, all my videos are now available in podcast form, so check that out. Again, that's linked below. It should be on all the major podcasting platforms. Third, if you enjoy this video, you can hit that like button, hit subscribe, and if you enjoy my channel, you can turn on that little bell so you get notified when my videos come out. And fourth, if you see value in the work that I do, please consider becoming a patron or making a one-time donation. Any amount helps, especially right now as I'm applying to grad schools. The application fees and the fees of sending my GRE scores cost like hundreds of dollars, which is like not fun. So I would be especially grateful for any one-time donation, especially at this point. But anyway, much love to all of y'all. You guys are helping fuel the channel and helping me pay student debt on the education that I use to make videos and serve you guys. And also, you get some pretty cool gifts by becoming a patron, including access to my notes, access to my research, papers, patron-exclusive videos and Q&As, and everything of that sort. A link again is in the description. All right, without further ado, let's dig in. Alright, long-term viewers know that I love my outlines. So first, we already looked at the intro to the video. Secondly, we're going to be looking at key terms that we need to understand the new argument against causal finitism. And then thirdly, we're going to be looking at that new argument itself. It's a version of a companions in guilt style argument. I'll explain what that is in due course. Then we're going to be looking at each premise of the argument in turn. It only has two premises and a conclusion. Fourth, we're going to be looking at two general responses to the new companions in guilt argument against causal finitism. Fifth, we're going to be looking at some broad brushstrokes reasons why I'm not a causal finitist myself, and then we shall conclude. Okay, so on to the key terms. So we first need some definitions on the table, which is what we're going to be looking at here, if I can click next properly. The first term is causal finitism. And there are three terms that we're going to be going over: causal finitism, dependence finitism, and companions in guilt style arguments. Okay, the first term here is causal finitism. According to causal finitism, nothing can have infinitely many causes, whether directly or indirectly. In other words, it's necessarily the case that nothing causally depends on infinitely many things. So, not only are infinite causal regresses impossible, but infinite causal cooperation is impossible too, because this involves something having infinitely many causes. This diagram here is actually from Alexander Pruss's book, Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, figure 2.1. The second term we need on the table is dependence finitism. According to dependence finitism, nothing can have infinitely many dependence bases, whether directly or indirectly. Dependence bases are just those things or facts or factors upon which something depends. And the notion of dependence at play here picks out any explanatory dependence relation. So it would include causal relations, but it would also include things like grounding, functional realization, truth-making, etc., etc. To put dependence finitism in other words, it says that necessarily nothing depends on infinitely many things. So again, not only are infinite dependence regresses impossible, as we saw in the previous slide on the left, but also infinite cooperative dependence is impossible too, as we saw in the previous slide on the right. So here's the kind of linear regress, here's the kind of cooperative dependence. Now, notice the deep similarities between causal finitism and dependence finitism. The former denies the possibility of infinite causal dependence, whereas the latter denies the possibility of infinite dependence simpliciter. Whereas the former denies the possibility of something having infinitely many causes, the latter denies the possibility of something having infinitely many dependence bases. They're very similar indeed. I just want you to notice their deep, deep similarities here, both in structure and in content. The third and final term that we need to cover is companions in guilt arguments. So a companions in guilt style argument basically tries to tie two positions together as companions in guilt. or I guess innocence as the case may be. The strategy is essentially to show that the positions stand or fall together. If you reject one, you should reject the other, and if you accept one, you should also accept the other. This, in turn, is usually motivated by some kind of parity or symmetry or deep similarity between the positions in question. They share important features in common, so much so that they should be accepted together or rejected together. They're companions, either in guilt if they should both be rejected, or innocence if they should both be accepted. Now, the new argument for causal finitism in this video is a companions in guilt style argument. But before discussing the argument, I think it's important to at least see an example of a companions in guilt style argument, and so here's perhaps the most famous example of such arguments. It's a simplified rendition of the companions in guilt argument for moral realism. The argument essentially says that if there are no objective facts about what we should do, then there are also no objective facts about how we should reason. This is motivated by the idea that any purportedly objectionable feature had by objective facts about how we should act would also be had by objective facts about how we should reason. For instance, both kinds of facts involve objective prescriptivity. That is, both prescribe ways things should be, independently of our desires or preferences or attitudes and the like. But, the argument continues, there are indeed objective facts about how we should reason, and hence we can conclude by modus tollens that there are also objective facts about how we should act, in which case moral realism is true. Now, I'm not here to defend this argument, okay, and it's not the topic of this video, it's just an example of the kind of argument under which this video's new argument against causal finitism falls. So, with these three key terms defined, let's consider that argument itself. That is to say... So, the new companions in guilt argument against causal finitism runs as follows. Premise 1, if causal finitism is true, then dependence finitism is true. Premise 2, but dependence finitism is false. So, conclusion 3, causal finitism is likewise false. I'll first discuss premise 1, after which I will discuss premise 2. So, let's get on to premise 1. So, according to premise 1, if causal finitism is true, then dependence finitism is also true. I'm going to spend less time on this premise since it seems quite plausible to me, and I haven't yet come across much pushback to it. The primary motivation for the premise is that, intuitively, there seems to be no relevant difference between causal finitism and dependence finitism that could account for why one, but not the other, would be true. There really does seem to be a kind of symmetry or parity between the theses, making it hard to drive a wedge between their truth values. Another sort of motivation is that if causal finitism is true, it's plausibly true in virtue of the nature of causation, or something about causal chains. Like, for instance, perhaps infinite causal dependence is a vicious kind of dependence, like perhaps it involves existence being infinitely deferred, never achieved. But dependence more generally plausibly shares those objectionable features, at least in infinite cases. Furthermore, causation and dependence plausibly have the same formal properties, like asymmetry, irreflexivity, and transitivity. All of these points lend support to premise 1, at least prima facie, and at least by my lights. Again, I'm being intentionally brief here because most of the action takes place at premise 2. So, having covered premise 1, let's get into that action. Okay. So, premise 2, which again is that dependence finitism is false, can be motivated in many ways. I'll survey 2 reasons that appeal to explicitly theistic assumptions and 2 that don't. It's perfectly kosher, in this context, to appeal to theists' own views, since causal finitism is very often wielded by theists on behalf of premises in cosmological arguments for God's existence. So, it's quite significant if theism itself affords us reasons for thinking dependence finitism is false. So the 4 reasons are reason number 1 from omniscience, that's a theistic reason. Reason number 2 from omnirationality, that's another theistic reason. And then reason number 3 from continuous time/space. And then finally reason 4, mathematical and set theoretic realism. Alright, so onwards we march to the first reason, which is from omniscience. This is really a cluster of 3 related reasons. So first, there are infinitely many truths, like 1 plus 1 equals 2, 1 plus 2 equals 3, 1 plus 3 equals 4, 1 plus 4 equals 5, etc. Or grass is green or 1 plus 1 equals 5. Grass is green or 1 plus 1 equals 6. Grass is green or, there are infinitely many truths. It's pretty easy to see that. Furthermore, knowledge that P depends on P. Right? Knowledge that something is true depends on that thing's being true. You can't know something that's false. If it were false, then you wouldn't know it. So knowledge partly depends on something's being true. It's partly because something is true that someone can be said to know that thing. Of course, they have to meet other conditions as well, but it's partly because the thing is true that they can be said to know it. So, there are infinitely many truths, and knowledge that P depends on its being the case that P. In that case, God's knowing all these truths partly explanatorily depends on infinitely many truths. And so, we here have a violation of dependence finitism, right? God's knowledge explanatorily depends, at least in part, on infinitely many truths. Second, if the future is, or even could be endless, then God's knowledge of what happens on each day of the endless future depends, or could depend, on what happens on each day of the endless future. That is, depends or could depend on infinitely many facts, in violation of dependence finitism. There are facts about what will happen 1 day from now, facts about what will happen 2 days from now, facts about what will happen 3 days from now, and so on for each natural number of days from now. And it follows from this that we have a violation of dependence finitism on our hands. God's knowledge, again, explanatorily depends, at least in part, on infinitely many truths. Third, God has infinitely many ideas about, for instance, numbers, abstracta, possibilia, different possible creatures that he can make, and so on. And so God's knowledge of his ideas, God's knowing the full range and extent of his ideas, depends on infinitely many ideas, right? It depends on those ideas being there for him to be able to know them in the first place. Once again, in violation of dependence finitism. Now, all these examples involve infinite explanatory cooperation, right? So again, all these examples involve infinitely many dependence bases explanatorily contributing to one term up here. So that's a kind of infinite cooperation. Infinite explanatory cooperation. But you might object that we don't actually have infinite explanatory cooperation here, since that requires one node to be explanatorily dependent on infinitely many other nodes, right? And yet, in the case at hand, we actually just have God's knowledge of each individual truth depending on just that truth. And so we don't actually have infinitely many nodes explanatorily contributing to a single node. But this response doesn't work, since we can just focus on God's knowing that he knows all of those infinitely many truths. This would involve a single node at the top and infinitely many nodes explanatorily contributing thereto. And if you still don't like this rejoinder, then we can just focus on God's knowledge of some infinite conjunctive truth of the form P and Q and R and S and etc. ad infinitum. Since knowledge partly explanatorily depends on the fact known, and since conjunctions depend on the truth of their conjuncts, God's knowledge of this conjunction will again end up violating dependence finitism. You might also object that these cases only work if God's contingent knowledge is intrinsic to God, whereas if divine simplicity is on the table, God's contingent knowledge is going to have to be extrinsic to God. But this seems wrong to me, right? Even if God's knowledge is extrinsic to God, such extrinsic facts about God's knowledge still depend on the relevant truths known. So you don't actually avoid violations of dependence finitism by locating God's knowledge outside of God. All that matters is that he knows the relevant truths, and that knowledge partly explanatorily depends on the truths known. Neither of these are particularly controversial, and neither of them seem to require that God's knowledge is intrinsic to God. Wherever God's knowledge is located, as it were, the knowledge still depends on the facts known, and that's really all you need here. And, of course, I'm setting aside the host of independent problems for that kind of proposal. You can see, for instance, my paper here, a response paper here, my response to that response paper, and more generally, my classical theism playlist, my published papers, my book, and so on. But I've set that aside here since I think my first response is sufficient on its own to allay the worry. Anyway, that finishes the first theistic reason for thinking dependence finitism is false, and hence that premise 2 of the companions in guilt argument is true. Let's move on to the second reason, which is also theistic, and it is from omni-rationality. This reason here is actually taken from Proust's book. He doesn't use it in the context of dependence finitism, but it can actually be adapted in that context. It's from page 185. He gives some reasons based on omni-rationality for thinking that dependence finitism is false. Now again, Proust doesn't himself connect the dots with dependence finitism, etc. So he's just talking about it in the context of causal finitism. But we can wield what he says on behalf of dependence finitism. So, plausibly, since God is omni-rational, he's all rational, he's perfectly rational, he's perfectly aware of all the reasons that there are. Because he's omni-rational, whenever he performs some act A, he acts on the basis of any and all reasons that there are favoring A. But, crucially, there are infinitely many reasons favoring the creation of our world. And hence, God's choice to create our world is explained, at least in part, by infinitely many reasons, which in turn violates dependence finitism. Why, you might ask, are there infinitely many reasons favoring the actualization of our world? Well, the fact that good G1 occurs on day 1 of this world's endless afterlife, that is a reason to actualize this world, right? It's a good that our world contains, and for any good, God has at least some reason to bring that good about precisely because of its positive value. Similarly, the fact that good G2 occurs on day 2 of this world's endless afterlife is also a reason to actualize this world, and more generally, for every natural number n, the fact that good Gn occurs on day n of this world's afterlife is a reason to actualize this world. Yet another violation of dependence finitism ensues if the future is endless, which firstly it certainly could be, and there are going to be able to be goods on each day of that endless future if God exists, right? We're under a theistic view. And second, most theists are of a religious bent and are already accepting an endless future. They think there's an endless afterlife, so we don't really have to worry about that. And again, all that I need here is that it's at least possible for the future to be endless under theism, and that certainly seems to be true. Again, Proust discusses this case as a potential challenge to causal finitism, and he ends up avoiding a violation thereof by holding that reasons non-causally explain God's choice to create this world. So he seems to be perfectly down with this being an argument that dependence finitism is false. All right, onwards we march to reason number 3 for thinking that premise 2 is true and for thinking that dependence finitism is false. So I won't here justify the view that space and time are continuous as opposed to discrete. That is, the view that there is no smallest unit of space or time, and that between any two spatial locations or times, there is another spatial location or time, indeed, infinitely many such spatial locations or times. I'll just note first that many philosophers take them to be continuous. Indeed, perhaps a majority of philosophers writing on this topic take them to be continuous, though I don't have hard statistics for that, but instead that's just my general impression engaging some of the literature here. And second, I'll note that some of our best, most well-confirmed physical theories treat them as continuous, and that this arguably gives us defeasible reason to think that they're continuous. Now, if time is continuous, then we plausibly get a violation of dependence finitism. Part of the reason I exist right now is because I existed a few moments ago. Obviously, that's not a full explanation of my current existence, but it's surely part of the explanation. These sorts of transtemporal relations are super important for personal identity, right? Most accounts of personal identity take some sort of transtemporal relation very seriously, such as psychological continuity, physical continuity, or something else of that sort. And it's also plausible that my bare existence right now is at least partly explained by my bare existence at previous times. Given all this, my existence and character right now is partly explained, whether directly or indirectly, by my existence and character at each previous time at which I existed. And since, if time is continuous, there are infinitely many such previous times, we again have a violation of dependence finitism on our hands. We can also use Proust's cannonball example here, his famous cannonball example. So part of the explanation for the state of the cannon, so imagine a cannon, and the cannon shoots the cannonball, it goes a trajectory, a certain finite trajectory, and it lands. Part of the explanation for the state of the cannon at any one point in its trajectory is the cannonball's state at each previous point in its trajectory, right? That's part of the explanation for why it has the character that it does at this particular point in its trajectory. For example, its velocity and momentum and position, etc., together with the laws and environmental conditions at those earlier times, partly explains why the cannonball has its current velocity, position, momentum, and so on, if we're treating a current time slice here as the one that we're focusing on. And that's going to be true for each individual time slice that we focus on, right? The state and position and momentum and velocity, etc. of the cannonball at any of those individual times is going to at least be partly explanatorily dependent on its state, like its velocity, its momentum, its position, etc., at previous times, together with the laws operative at those times and their environmental conditions. If time is continuous, then we once again have an infinite dependence regress here. Similarly, if space is continuous, then we plausibly get another violation of dependence finitism. Plausibly, part of the reason why I, or your mother, have the precise three-dimensional shape that we have is that, speaking of me now, I have parts occupying the regions that they do, right? So, again, part of the reason, this is plausible at least, part of the reason why I have the precise three-dimensional shape that I have is that I have parts occupying the regions that they do. If space is continuous, then there will be infinitely many such regions. and hence my shape will depend, at least in part, on infinitely many facts reporting what spatial regions my parts occupy. Other explanatory schemas can be cited here for continuous space, like focusing on different explanans and different explananda, but that suffices for illustrative purposes. Now, I know it's likely that there are complicated ways to get around some of these cases. Alas, they'll typically involve as in the ways of getting around, the complicated ways of getting around these cases that I presented. These complicated ways will typically involve adding bells and whistles and incurring various quite high complexity costs, and furthermore, it's not clear that they can handle the whole concoction of different purported violations of dependence finitism that arise from the continuity of space and/or time. I've only given a small sampling here so that you can get the gist of the reasoning. Anyway, let's now consider the fourth reason on behalf of premise 2 in the companions in guilt argument against causal finitism. And that reason is from mathematical and set theoretical realism. So, plausibly, there are numbers, and if so, there are infinitely many of them. It's also plausible that there are sets, but if so, then there's the set containing the natural numbers. And since sets depend on their members, we have one thing, namely the set containing the natural numbers, explanatorily dependent on infinitely many other things, namely all the natural numbers. You could, of course, simply embrace nominalism about numbers and sets, but note that nominalism does have costs, and that there are lots of arguments for realism. If you're curious about some of those arguments, you can check out my playlist on God and Abstract Objects. Another response to this fourth reason is that it assumes Platonism in particular, and yet causal finitists, at least of a theist stripe, are likely to reject Platonism. But this is simply untrue. The reasoning only assumes that there are numbers and sets, right? It doesn't assume that they're free-floating, non-spatiotemporal, necessarily existent, acausal abstract objects existing independently of minds and the concrete world. Perhaps sets and numbers are ideas in the mind of God. Even still, this reasoning goes through, right, since it only requires that numbers and sets exist. So long as they exist, the nature or character or identity conditions of the set are dependent on its members, and since it has infinitely many members, it follows that dependence finitism is violated. Platonism is totally unnecessary to see this. All you need is realism about the relevant objects. As I've explained, and as everyone recognizes, Platonism isn't the only form of realism. A still further response one might make to this fourth reason is to allow for infinitely many necessary causes bearing on a target state, and to restrict causal finitism to ruling out the possibility only of infinitely many contingent causes bearing on a target state. In that case, the relevant companion position would have to be a similarly restricted dependence finitism, restricted, that is, to ruling out the possibility only of infinitely many contingent dependence bases for some target explanandum, or thing being explained. And so the case involving necessarily existent numbers explaining a necessarily existing set would not, after all, count as a violation of this restricted dependence finitism. So the idea here is that the causal finitist, in restricting her causal finitism, thereby imposes a corresponding restriction on premise 1 of the companions in guilt argument. For the dependence finitism to be truly symmetric with the restricted causal finitism, it too will have to be restricted in like manner. Thus, we'll have to change the first premise to something like the following. 1 star. If causal finitism as restricted to contingent causes is true, then dependence finitism as restricted to contingent dependence bases is also true. And then, if we want to infer the denial of the antecedent here, we need to correspondingly alter the second premise, which denies the consequent. And so we get 2 star, but dependence finitism as restricted to contingent dependence bases is false, from which, of course, it follows that 3 star. So, causal finitism as restricted to contingent causes is false. The trouble, though, is that the case involving the natural numbers and the set containing them no longer supports premise 2 star here, right? Since 2 star here crucially allows for the possibility of having infinitely many necessarily existent dependence bases, right? Again, 2 star only says that having infinitely many contingently existent dependence bases is impossible. And so the case of the natural numbers and the set containing them is simply irrelevant to the truth of 2 star. Okay, so that is the response by means of restricting causal finitism. How should one respond to this response? Well, I think that there are a few points to make. First, it seems quite costly, at least by my lights, since adopting it renders you unable to solve, by means of this restricted causal finitism, several new variants of precisely the same paradoxes that Proust and other causal finitists developed, in particular the paradoxes that they originally developed to motivate causal finitism in the first place. For instance, just imagine that there are infinitely many angelic beings, each of which has a unique natural number, where each angel is bent on killing Fred if and only if no angel with a larger number kills Fred. And suppose further that these angelic beings all necessarily exist. This is just a standard Benedetti paradox, and the angels here are doing the same thing that Grim Reapers do in the Grim Reaper paradox. It seems exceedingly strange and implausible to adopt a solution to Benedetti paradoxes that would kill only those Benedetti paradoxes that involve contingent causes, and so wouldn't kill this one involving the angelic beings. It seems that given the deep structural similarities among all Benedetti paradoxes, involving as they all do the unsatisfiable pair on the screen, any solution to some Benedetti paradox should kill the whole suite of Benedetti paradoxes. And yet the proposed restriction on causal finitism prevents it from satisfying this criterion of adequacy for solutions to Benedetti paradoxes. I would argue then that restricting causal finitism in the manner prescribed here incurs some quite serious costs. Granted, you can adopt a disconnected approach and add further theses to kill the relevant Benedetti paradoxes involving necessary causes, but this does render your overall solution to Benedetti paradoxes much less simple, much less elegant, and reduces its explanatory scope. So you're starting to carve into your original reasons for accepting causal finitism as a solution to various infinitary paradoxes. And furthermore, adopting such a disconnected approach doesn't address my point that, intuitively, given the deep structural similarities among all Benedetti paradoxes, any solution to some Benedetti paradox should kill the whole suite of Benedetti paradoxes. Alright, so that's kind of my first general response to this response involving restricting causal finitism. My second response to the response is that I wonder what relevant difference there is between infinite causal dependence among contingent causes, on the one hand, and infinite causal dependence among necessary causes, on the other hand, that could account for why we should restrict causal finitism to ruling out the possibility only of the former, not the latter. If there is no such reason, as seems to be the case, at least by my lights, then this response simply succumbs to another companions in guilt argument, right? Just consider the following argument on screen. 1 prime. If infinite causal dependence among contingent causes is impossible, well then infinite causal dependence among necessary causes is also impossible. 2 prime. Infinite causal dependence among contingent causes is impossible, which is granted by the response in question. And so 3 prime. Infinite causal regresses among necessary causes are also impossible. That says is, it should say ah. What we learn from this is that causal finitism shouldn't, after all, be restricted just to contingent causes, as this response suggests, since there seems to be no relevant difference between infinite contingent causal dependence and infinite necessary causal dependence. All right, so that's the 4 reasons favoring premise 2. Again, the first reason was from omniscience. That was an explicitly theistic reason. The second reason was from omnirationality, another explicitly theistic reason. The third reason was from continuous time and space. It's kind of a cluster of reasons, but I put them under that third reason banner. And then the fourth reason was from mathematical and set theoretic realism. And here, for the last little portion of the video, I was just fending off some objections to that fourth reason. But let's now consider 2 general responses to the companions in guilt argument against causal finitism. Again, I've kind of been defending my reasons in favor of premise 2 along the way against certain responses or objections, but here are just 2 general responses that I would like to at least discuss, and perhaps potentially allay. Again, I'm not sure whether or not the new companions in guilt argument against causal finitism succeeds. This video is exploratory in nature, as I said at the outset, but still, let's look at these 2 general responses, and I will offer some brief thoughts on them. So a first response is that premise 2 is itself reason to think that premise 1 is false. Recall that premise 1 said that if causal finitism is true, then dependence finitism is true, and premise 2 said that dependence finitism is false. Okay, so this response here is saying that premise 2, the truth of that, is itself reason to think that premise 1 is false. Why is that? Well, because premise 2 shows us that there are reasons, or at least the reasons in favor of premise 2, show us that there are reasons to think that dependence finitism is false. that aren't in turn causal in nature, right? The reasons for thinking that dependence finitism is false aren't causal in nature, and so they don't give us corresponding reason to think that causal finitism is false. And in that case, the two positions don't stand or fall together, as premise 1 asserts. Okay, so that's the first response. So I think this objection is valuable, and it's not unreasonable. Still, at least at the moment, I'm not convinced that it works. In general, conditionals don't turn on their consequence, right? Just because the conditional's consequent is false, that doesn't mean that the conditional itself is false. As an illustration, suppose I argue that if a blue ball could come into existence uncaused, then a red ball could also come into existence uncaused. And suppose my reason for thinking this is that there seems to be no relevant difference between a blue ball and a red ball when it comes to uncaused beginnings. Clearly, it's no use responding to that conditional by arguing that a red ball couldn't come into existence uncaused. That is, by arguing for the falsity of the conditional's consequent. That simply doesn't challenge the conditional itself, and nor does it challenge the reasons offered on its behalf. In particular, it doesn't challenge the epistemic symmetry, or parity, between those two, right? Between a red ball coming into existence and a blue ball coming into existence. Similarly, right, in the case at hand, challenging the consequent, as premise 2 does, right, saying that the consequent is false, doesn't seem by itself to be a reason to challenge the conditional itself. And it doesn't challenge the reasons offered on its behalf, right? Because it doesn't challenge the epistemic symmetry or parity between the theses of dependence finitism and causal finitism, which motivated the conditional to begin with. So again, the response at hand to the companions in guilt argument just doesn't address the epistemic symmetry or parity that motivates the first premise. And with that motivation in hand, we have good reason to accept premise 1. Once we combine this with reasons to reject the consequent, we should simply infer by modus tollens that the antecedent is false. That, it seems to me, is the more appropriate maneuver here. But of course I recognize room for reasonable disagreement. Alright, a second general response, and the final one that we're going to be considering, is very similar to one that we saw in response to the fourth reason in favor of premise 2 based on mathematical and set theoretical realism. The response here, response number 2, is to allow for infinite causal cooperation and to restrict causal finitism to ruling out the possibility only of linearly ordered infinite causal regresses. In that case, the relevant companion position would have to be a similarly restricted dependence finitism, restricted, that is, to ruling out the possibility only of linear infinite dependence regresses. And so the cases involving infinite explanatory cooperation won't, after all, count as violations of this restricted dependence finitism. Remember, a lot of my cases involved infinite explanatory cooperation. And so, if you're restricting dependence finitism in this manner so as to be a relevant companion position to the restricted causal finitism in this manner, well then those cases are actually no longer going to be targeting this restricted dependence finitism, right? So the idea here, again, is that the causal finitist, in restricting her causal finitism, thereby imposes a corresponding restriction on premise 1 of the companions in guilt argument. For the dependence finitism to be truly symmetric with the restricted causal finitism, it too will have to be restricted in like manner. Thus, we'll have to change the first premise of the companions in guilt to the following. 1 star star. If causal finitism as restricted to linear causal regresses is true, well then dependence finitism as restricted to linear dependence regresses is true. And then, if we want to infer the denial of the antecedent here, we need to correspondingly alter the second premise, which denies the consequent. So we get 2 star star. Dependence finitism as restricted to linear dependence regresses is false, from which it follows that 3 star star. So causal finitism as restricted to linear causal regresses is false. The trouble, though, is that the cases involving infinite explanatory cooperation no longer support premise 2 star star, right? Since 2 star star allows for the possibility, in principle, of infinite explanatory cooperation. Again, 2 star star only says that infinite linear explanatory regresses are impossible. So the cases of nonlinear cooperation are simply irrelevant to the truth of premise 2 star star. They don't target it. They don't support it. So what are we to make of this response? Well, I have 3 responses to the response number 2. So, first, it doesn't address the reason number 3 from continuous time that I offered on behalf of the second premise in the original companions and guilt argument, right? Since that reason, right, reason number 3, involved not explanatory cooperation, but infinite explanatory regress, right? Remember, it was like a infinitely linearly ordered chain of times, right? So this response at least isn't going to be targeting all the reasons that I offered on behalf of premise 2 of the companions and guilt argument. So it's still not going to save the companions and guilt argument. So that's my first response to response number 2. My second response to response number 2 is that the response is quite costly, since then, again, you're unable to solve, by means of this restricted causal finitism, several of the paradoxes that Proust and other causal finitists developed originally to motivate causal finitism. My third response is that I wonder what relevant difference there is between infinite causal cooperation and infinite causal regress that could account for why the latter, but not the former, is impossible. If there's no such reason, then this response yet again succumbs to another companions and guilt argument, right? Just consider the following. 1 prime prime. If infinite causal regresses are impossible, then infinite causal cooperation is impossible. 2 prime prime, but infinite causal cooperation is possible, which is granted by this rejoinder. And so 3 prime prime, infinite causal regresses are possible, contra this response's suggested restriction on causal finitism. All right, so those are the 2 general responses that I'm going to be considering. And now let's get into the section of why I'm not a causal finitist. Yes, indeed. So in this last part of the video, I want to give an all too brief synopsis of why I'm not convinced of causal finitism. Now, note, these are not all the reasons why I'm not a causal finitist. Let me say that again. These are not all the reasons why I'm not a causal finitist. Obviously, this should say finitist, not causal finitism, okay? Clearly, I'm not a causal finitism. But yeah, so these are not all the reasons. They're just some salient ones that I had the time to cover in the short video with adherent apologetics. So yes, I'm about to be playing a clip of a discussion that I had with Zach over at Adherent Apologetics. You can find all my discussions with other people on other channels in my playlist, My YouTube Appearances, if you're curious, and also, more generally, check out all of my playlists. But yeah, that's what we're going to be looking at in this next part of the video. Note also that not being a causal finitist doesn't entail that I think infinite causal regresses are possible, right? It doesn't mean that I think causal finitism is false. It simply means that I'm not convinced that all kinds of infinite causal regresses are impossible. Ultimately, I don't think I know. I think I'm just not sure whether or not causal finitism is true. I have lots of reasons for rejecting it, and I have some reasons for thinking that it's true. So, yeah, I don't really know what to make of it. And I hope to convey some of those reasons in what follows. If you want more fleshed out reasons for why I'm not a causal finitist, I highly recommend checking out my Kalam playlist and the videos therein on causal finitism, the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis, Benedetti paradoxes, etc. Some of that is also buried within or confined within responses to others, such as Trent Horn. So I highly recommend checking out that portion of my Kalam playlist. Right, so here's the Kalam playlist. I just want to point you to which videos I talk about the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis and causal finitism and so on. So first, I'm going to be putting all the videos in my Kalam series with Stephen here at the very beginning. Then I look at Hilbert's Hotel, so it's organized topically. So these are my 2 videos on Hilbert's Hotel. Then we go to Successive Edition, right? So I've got 2 videos on Successive Edition, etc. And again, we're going to be covering these in the Kalam series with Stephen. After Successive Edition, though, we start talking about Grim Reapers, causal finitism, the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis, etc. Right? So this video is on that. This video is on that. This video talks about that. This video, the look at the timestamps in there because the section on the Kalam is on that. Same thing here. Same thing here. This one is also on the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis, etc. And talks about Patrick principles. This one. So in the middle here, this middle block is all about causal finitism, Grim Reapers, etc. And then we go on to stuff about like stage 2 a little bit, very briefly in here. I talk about some paradoxes of infinity, then stuff on Locke, other discussions with other philosophers, or discussions on other channels that I found very salient. This one right here also talks a little bit about the Patrick principles and the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. Same with this bad apologetics one here. And then, there's the scientific case here that's talked about. And so on. So, yeah, I highly recommend checking out, this one's also on stage 2, this 20 cosmological arguments and analysis that discusses various stage 2 aspects of the Kalam. Okay, so without further ado, let's get on to the adherent apologetics video wherein I explain at least some of the reasons why I'm not a causal finitist.
be listening to this and wondering, like, dang, Joe, this is pretty good. Like, why don't you just like be a full-on causal finitist, bro? Get on the train, let's go. So what holds you back, Joe, then from being like a full-on causal finitist?
Our intuitions were cultivated and shaped by interaction with finite things around us. Should we expect our intuitions about infinity to be reliable? It's not at all clear. So like that's one problem with appealing to like these kinds of intuitions that I do in this article. And also, like, again, debarring, even if we grant some of these principles, like, just because some infinite causal chains are impossible, that doesn't license you in inferring that all of them are impossible. Now, you might try to justify that by appeal to Patrick principles, but I have various reservations for Patrick principles and so on. I think they have lots of counterexamples, and we're applying them in domains very, very far removed from our ordinary experience, right? So we never in our ordinary experience are we using Patrick principles to patch together infinitely large worlds with infinite causal chains in them. No, the Patrick principle that we use in everyday modal reasoning is like, I've got a book here and it could be over there. Like those sorts of like very humdrum, ordinary, very everyday grounded modal inferences. And those might be justified, even though the very far removed from our ordinary experience modal recombinations, maybe we don't have good reason to think that those are possible, precisely because they're so far removed from our ordinary experience. We just don't know what would be possible in such cases. So, like, I have reservations for each of the extant sort of arguments that people offer for causal finitism, including my own. For a lot of the paradoxes that are cited, for instance, in Proust and Kuhn's and so on, I think that there are other simpler, potentially more powerful solutions or ways to kill the relevant paradoxes. So on my channel, I go through the unsatisfiable paradiagnosis, which in my view, quite powerfully shows that a lot of these paradoxes, not the ones that I developed, but a lot of the Benedetti paradoxes, like Grim Reapers and so on, what's responsible for those paradoxes doesn't have anything to do with causation. Rather, it has to do with an abstract structure that they instantiate. And the abstract structure is basically, ultimately, like just saying P and not P. It's just harder to see. But that abstract structure shows you that, like, you can even generate non-causal versions of these paradoxes. Like, you can, and I go through this on my channel, on my Kalam playlist. But, like, I think that tells us that it's not infinite causal chains that's doing the work, that's the culprit here. It's this abstract structure. So, like, that's for sort of certain Benedetti paradoxes, and I advise people to see my Kalam playlist for more on that, and I've got stuff under review. So that's one reason, right? That's one reason why I'm not a causal finitist, just because I have reservations for lots of the extant arguments for causal finitism, including my own. So that's one reason. A second reason is that big problems for these arguments is that a lot of them seem to entail that the future cannot be endless. But it seems to me that it's really plausible that the future could be endless. And for instance, Christianity entails that it is endless, and as does like Islam and so on. So like in Benedetti paradoxes, you could just imagine, so instead of each reaper doing something, if and only if no earlier reaper does something, with infinitely many earlier reapers, you can have each reaper doing something if and only if no future reaper does something. And if you have infinitely many of those reapers, each of which is instantiating that rule, well, then you get the exact same contradiction. You can just derive it. So I can get out the little paper and pen and show you how you get the same contradiction from that. And then, of course, you might say, oh, well, how are these reapers sensitive to what's happening in the future, right? In the past, you can kind of see, right, in a mechanism as to how that could happen, right? Because it's in the past, right? Usually our dispositions are past sensitive. Like, I see something that happened in the past and I can act on that. How can you act on and know things that happen in the future? Well, that's where you bring in God, right? Defenders of these Benedetti paradoxes are almost universally theists, or at least traditionally. They're traditionally theists, and so they think God exists and knows the future. And so God can reveal to individual reapers whether or not some reaper in its future swings its scythe, let's say. So there are, and so if this could show that there can't be infinite causal chains past-oriented wise, or if there can't be infinite pasts, because if you could, then you'd be able to have this sort of paradox, well, then it would also show that you can't have infinite futures, which would entail that Christianity is false, which would, and it's also just really implausible, right? The future could be endless. That just seems really plausible. That's another one of my reservations for a lot of these arguments, and I've also got some stuff under review on that. So yeah, the first main reason is reservations for the arguments. The second main reason is just like, not merely reservations and like unclarities and so on, but like big problems that I think I see with the arguments. A third one is just that causal finitism is, shall we say, very metaphysically profligate. What that means is that it's really unsimple. It's a wide sweeping, unsimple thesis about the structure of reality. It's saying there cannot be infinite causal chains of any form whatsoever, and that rules out lots of ways that we might otherwise think that reality could be. And it rules out, arguably, it rules out infinite paths. It rules out, arguably, show that time is necessarily discrete rather than being able to be infinitely divided, right? Because suppose that time did have these kinds of infinite divisions already in it. Suppose that time weren't discrete. Suppose that there weren't smallest units of time. Well, then let me just drop this right now. I'm just going to drop a pen, if you could see this. Okay, I just dropped a pen. Now, its end state there is causally dependent on its various states throughout that process of me dropping it, right? Part of the explanation, the causal explanation for why the pen ended where it did at the very end is because, let's say, halfway through, it had such and such velocity, such and such laws of nature were operative, its state was such and such, it had such and such momentum, and so on. So, like, its state at each of these instants throughout the way is causally relevant to its state at the very end. They cause it at least indirectly. And so what that means is that in any ordinary causal process, you have an infinite causal chain in violation of causal finitism if time is not discrete, plausibly. And what that tells us is that, I mean, causal finitism is going to have to entail that time is discrete. It's like, whoa, that's a major implication. Like, lots of philosophers think that time not only, time could be continuous, right? I mean, because causal finitism says that these causal chains are impossible, it would show that time is necessarily discrete. So, like, a lot of philosophers think, like, not only is continuous space, or this infinitely divisible space, not only is that actually true, but I mean, it's at least possible, right? You might think that. But like, and some of our best scientific theories treat space, or treat time as if it's continuous, treat time as if it's infinitely divisible. And so, like, I don't know, man. It just has, causal finitism just has so many of these sweeping implications for the structure of reality. And arguably, you're going to be able to, for precisely the same reasoning, you're going to have to show that space is necessarily discrete. So, like, there's a smallest unit of space for the same sorts of reasons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, you start to realize all these massive implications of causal finitism about just the structure of reality. And not only that, the necessary structure of reality. And you start to be like, whoa, I did not sign up for that when I was just looking at these paradoxes. Like, and I mean, a lot of, like, there are lots of philosophers who think that time is not discrete and that space is not discrete. And still more philosophers who think that at least it could fail to be discrete, or it could, etc. But if causal finitism is true, then it couldn't fail to be discrete. It's necessarily discrete, etc. So it's like, and there are more of these implications. I'm just going through a few. So it's like, it's such an unsimple hypothesis. It's like, you think you're signing up to this innocuous claim, but like, it has these wide-reaching implications that are potentially even in conflict with, like, empirical science. I mean, like, again, some of our scientific theories that are exceptionally well confirmed treat time as if it's continuous, as if it's infinitely divisible, and so on. So it's just, you need to be hesitant if you're trying to adopt causal finitism, just because of how unsimple it is. All else being equal, we would prefer much simpler solutions to these various paradoxes if we can. So that's the third broad reason. I'd say the fourth broad reason is that, I don't know, like, a lot of these arguments just rely on applying either intuitions or applying modal principles far removed from our ordinary experience. I don't know, our intuitions are cultivated by, again, like, our interactions with the finite world. And yet lots of these paradoxes of infinity and so on are trying to apply principles that we find intuitively obvious, or find intuitively plausible, to these, these far-reaching infinite domains that are so far removed from our ordinary experience. And it's like, it's difficult to see how you could be justified in doing that. Similarly with lots of other principles, like Kuhn's uses an infinitary Patrick principle. And, when Kuhn's is introducing his argument, he's saying, oh yeah, well, we use Patrick principles in everyday reasoning, we use Patrick principles to be able to tell if I'm able to take this route, if it's blocked or so on. It's like, okay, even if that's true, you can doubt that. But okay, set that aside. Even if that's true, we use a kind of humdrum everyday Patrick principle. We most certainly do not use an infinitary Patrick principle, where you can recombine infinitely many things in these infinitely many ways. It's like, I don't use that in my everyday reasoning, and I don't think anyone else does. So, and it's like, why should I think that principle, why should I afford any confidence in the deliverances of that principle if it's so far removed from our ordinary experience, and it's concerning, like, these far out metaphysical possibilities? I mean, even the nature of metaphysical modality is steeped in unclarity and so on. So it's like, I don't know. It's like, I'm really hesitant with respect to these modal facts in domains that are super far removed from our ordinary humdrum experience, and I'm hesitant to apply principles that seem plausible, especially in finite cases, applying them to infinite cases. So that's maybe a fourth reason. Oh, and then I guess if you want to say, okay, Joe, like, if you can get around those worries, and you can say, well, no, we actually can apply these sorts of principles to domains removed far from ordinary experience. We can apply intuitions beyond them. So it's basically a dilemma. if we can't apply these principles in intuitions, or at least we're arguably unjustified in doing so, then a lot of these arguments for causal finitism fail. But if we can apply them, this side of the dilemma, well, then actually bunches of these modal epistemological tools actually count against causal finitism, right? I can conceive, conceivability. I can conceive of infinite causal chains. I can conceive of perfectly benign ones, like me just dropping this thing. I can conceive of space-time being continuous, with being infinitely divisible, and I can just drop this. I mean, that's perfectly well conceivable, and so an infinite causal chain is perfectly conceivable. And if conceivability gives us defeasible evidence for possibility, then I have some weight of a reason to think that infinite causal chains are possible. Contra causal finitism. Same with imaginability, right? I can imagine these sorts of things, and that's a modal epistemological tool, and I'm applying it in domains far removed from our ordinary experience, but still. Again, we're on that horn of the dilemma where we're justified in doing that. Modal uniformity or continuity. Some of your listeners might be familiar with Josh Rasmussen and some of his work. But Josh Rasmussen basically has a principle of modal uniformity or continuity. And it basically says that if y is possible, and if y differs merely in quantity from x, then we have defeasible reason to think that x is also possible. To me, that seems prima facie plausible, right? We shouldn't posit violations in otherwise uniform quantitative classes unless we have positive reasons for thinking otherwise. If we apply this to infinite causal chains, well, I mean, hey, we have really good reason to think that any finitely long causal chain is possible. And given that infinitely long causal chains differs from such finite chains merely quantitatively, and given that the latter are uniformly possible, per Josh's own principle, we have defeasible reason to think that infinite causal chains are likewise possible. Similarly with modal recombination, right? Remember, I appeal to a recombination principle in arguing for causal finitism, and some other authors do as well. But actually, boatloads of recombination principles deliver the possibility of an infinite past and infinite causal chains. So David Lewis's principle allows this. Daniel Nolan's Patrick principle allows this. But basically, you can just patch together space-time regions themselves, right? So we know that space-time regions are individually possible. Let's say a space-time region containing this desk and this hour, right, that we've been here. Well, if I can duplicate space-time regions and duplicate the contents of space-time regions and rearrange them in various ways, well, then I should be able to take this one that I know is actually possible because it's actual, and I should be able to duplicate it infinitely often. And what that shows is that you could have an infinite past because you can just duplicate this space-time region infinitely often into an infinite past. We know that it's actual, and we know that we can do these duplications and recombinations and so on. And I just don't see any relevant difference between patching together space-time regions themselves from, let's say, patching together contents of space-time regions. But anyway. So, like, a lot of these modal principles count against causal finitism, the very ones that are used in these sorts of arguments for causal finitism. The sixth problem is that, we might think, listen, a lot of people say an infinite past is really counterintuitive. It's just weird. But a finite past is so weird as well. I mean, I don't know, think about it. It's so weird. If the past is finite, I mean, arguably, right, if the past is finite, well then, something plausibly brought the past into existence. That thing could in itself be in the past. It couldn't itself be in time because it's supposed to be what's responsible for time, right? So you'd have to have some sort of timeless to temporal causation, something like timelessly causing something. It's like, how do you get a temporal effect from a timeless cause? I mean, that's not really an argument, but it is an intuition. I mean, a lot of people do share this intuition that, how could you have timeless to temporal causation, something timeless, somehow bringing about a temporal effect? A lot of people think that that's just extremely counterintuitive, but it's also inductively implausible, right? I mean, inductively speaking, all the causes in our experience are temporal to temporal causes, and that gives us some weight of a reason to think that all causes are temporal to temporal causes. Just as the fact that we see in our experience that every beginning has a cause gives us some weight of a reason to think that every beginning whatsoever has a cause. And there are more problems that you could point out for a finite past. It's just, people ignore the counterintuitive nature of a finite past by focusing on the counterintuitive nature of an infinite past by their lights. But you turn the tables and it's still you get lots of implausibilities. It's man, there's a timeless cause of this, and it's did that timeless thing somehow become temporal? How is that not a change? And if it was a change, how is it not the case that it used to exist in timelessly? But that doesn't make any sense, right? You can't used to exist timelessly because that's saying that the timeless thing stands in temporal relation to other things. The timeless thing would be in the past. So then does it always exist timelessly? But then that seems really weird. Then you'd have a timeless God or somehow some other timeless object which is continually sustaining a changing creation. If presentism is true, that gets you into a lot of big trouble. So A finite path is difficult, man. It's very difficult. I mean, so is an infinite path, but both of them are difficult. I mean, we're at the edge of human thought. Something weird is happening. But if someone wants to rely on intuition to rule out infinite paths, well, then arguably they should rely on intuition in this case as well. And if there are these intuitive problems for a finite path, that might justify us in thinking that, hey, the path couldn't be finite. And if the path couldn't be finite, then plausibly it's infinite. If the path is infinite, well, then arguably you get a denial of causal finitism from that. Because the path is infinite, if you think that causation provides time with its directionality and unity, such that what unifies something into one timeline is a kind of continuous flow of causation and continuous causal links. What that means is that you would have an infinite causal chain in an infinite past. So if you think that there are problems for a finite past, and that if you think that there are such problems, that can motivate you in thinking that the past is infinite, or at the very least that it could be infinite. And if it could be infinite, then it could be the case, plausibly, that there can be infinite causal chains, which is a violation of causal finitism. So again, none of these, again, I'm not giving anything that's like strictly entailing causal finitism's falsehood or these other sorts of things. I guess my point is just like, there are some reasons that people can have that aren't implausible to think that causal finitism might not be true. And like I said, I'm agnostic on these sorts of things because I do think that there's an interesting case to be made from causal finitism. It does have explanatory power in killing a number of different paradoxes in disparate domains. So that is something going for it, right? There are other ways to kill lots of these paradoxes, but I mean, causal finitism does give you a unified solution to them, and that's desirable, right? You want a unifying solution that can unify these disparate host of domains and so on. And it seems to be explanatorily powerful as well. So as you can see, I'm agnostic on the matter. And I think a lot of people in these sorts of domains suffer from a little bit too much confidence, either in the truth or falsity of causal finitism. And I just think there are considerations on both sides, people. And the lay of the land of reasons is vaster than you might think.
All right, so that does it. I hope this video has served you. I hope my channel and my content and my work serves you. Again, if you see value in the hours upon hours upon hours upon hours upon hours that I pour into this channel without getting paid, please consider supporting me on Patreon or making a one-time donation. Any amount helps, and much love. And again, please be sure to like, subscribe, turn on the little bell for notifications. YouTube doesn't, unfortunately, show you the videos that you actually want to watch, so you have to turn on notifications to see that. And anyway, what better way to end is there than? I'm Joe Schmidt. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.